This is The Future Of, where experts share their vision of the future and how their work is helping shape it for the better.
Hello, I'm David Carston. In Australia, the cane toad is an extremely destructive pest. It outcompetes native animals for food and habitat and wreaks havoc on the agriculture industry. It's also poisonous to many would-be predators such as quolls, snakes, and even crocodiles. This invasive amphibian has spread throughout northern Australia and is now set to descend upon the Pilbara region of WA. If not stopped, up to 95% of the Pilbara will be colonised by cane toads, which will directly impact scores of our native species. In this episode, I'm joined by Professor Ben Phillips, a population biologist in Curtin's School of Molecular and Life Sciences. We talk about how the project he's leading, the Toad Containment Zone, is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to stop the toxic spread of the cane toad in WA. If you'd like to find out more about the project, you can visit the links provided in the show notes. Ben, first of all, we need some context. What are these cane toads and how and why were they introduced to Australia?
Yeah, well, it's a long story. So they're essentially a large frog that from the Amazonian rainforest. They were brought to islands in the Caribbean in the 1800s. And then again, so several islands in the Caribbean in the 1800s, but then again in the 1920s by the sugar industry in the Caribbean, looking for things that might help control insect pests in sugarcane. And so, that was as far as they'd gone. The Caribbean is not that far from South America, and that was where it sat until I think it was 1932. There was a world congress of sugar growing people, happened to be in Puerto Rico, and toads had been introduced into Puerto Rico a few years earlier, and there was a woman there gave a presentation. Her name was Raquel Dexter. She gave a presentation saying that since toads had been introduced to Puerto Rico, the sugar yields had gone up in the 2 years after the cane toads had been brought into Puerto Rico. And from that and a few other little bits and pieces, she was kind of making the argument that toads might be a really good biological control for sugarcane pests. And there was a couple of people there. There was a couple of people from Australia. There was a guy from Hawaii there. And the guy from Hawaii was so impressed with this talk, he just grabbed some toads right then and there and took them back to Hawaii.
Oh, she brought samples?
Yeah, he brought live toads back to Hawaii because back in the day you could just do that, right? So he brought a whole bunch of toads back to Hawaii and just released them immediately. And then over a few years, he corresponded with the people in Australia and said, "Oh, it's working great. The toads are doing really well." And so he convinced the people in Australia to come over and grab some of the toads that he'd introduced to Hawaii. So the Bureau of Sugar Experimental Research up in North Queensland paid one of their staff members, a guy called Reg Montgomery, to catch a train down to Brisbane, a steamer across to Hawaii. Him and the Hawaiian fella collected a bunch of toads in the hotel yard, and they brought them back to Australia and let them go. And the rest is history, basically.
We're naming names: Raquel, Reg.
Yep. There's a few others to name. We could go. There's a hero in the story too. So a few years after they released toads, a few months after they released toads, I should say, there was a guy by the name of Walter Froggatt.
No.
No. Walter Froggatt. He was the chief entomologist for Australia at the time, so that's someone who thinks hard about insects. But he was very concerned that releasing toads would be a major disaster, and he made that argument. And the federal government said, "Oh, look, you should stop doing this," and they put a ban on further releases of toads. That instantly set the sugar industry into lobbying mode. They lobbied hard to their premier. Their premier lobbied hard to the Prime Minister of Australia, and the ban got lifted about 6 months later after a direct letter from the Australian Prime Minister's office saying, "Release the toads."
Let's backtrack a little for more context. For those of us that don't know, how important was the Australian sugar industry to our economy in the 1930s?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure how important it was to our economy compared to things like sheep and wheat and so forth, but it was certainly a important part of North Queensland's economy. I guess for further historical context, you really need to take into account that this idea of biological control, that you could bring one thing to help control another thing, was really just getting going as an idea. People were really excited about it. And we'd had this major success in Australia with prickly pear and a little moth called Cactoblastus. So prickly pear had been a major weed, and some scientists brought this little moth across, and it basically solved the problem, right? So there was this amazing success story that had just happened, and so biological control was a really hot idea at the time, and so perhaps some things got done that probably should have been thought through a little more carefully.
So we're getting some great feedback from Raquel over in Puerto Rico and Sugar Guy in Hawaii, but of course that is purely from a sugar output and productivity perspective. Was there any conflicting evidence or supplementary evidence about the effect on local wildlife in those two environments?
I think there may have been a few comments along the lines of, oh, they're doing fine and everything seems okay. And maybe that was true in Puerto Rico, or maybe it was true in Hawaii, but it certainly wasn't in Australia. Although that story of impact on wildlife really took some decades to emerge. So toads, certainly the first scientific paper or the first magazine article even that started to talk about their impacts was in the 1960s. So toads had been in the country for well over 30 years before people were starting to raise, legitimate concerns about the impacts that they were having.
Once Walter Froggatt's warnings had been adhered to and then subsequently ignored or rebuffed, what were those fallouts, both economically and also in terms of wildlife? It's been phenomenal, the scale of it.
Yeah, that's right. So I think the first thing is the scale. So Walter Froggatt, said that cane toads will may become as big a pest as rabbits, and that there's no limit to their westward spread was his line. And that's proved to be very prophetic. Like they're still spreading westward 90 years later. So they now occupy something like 1.6 million square kilometres of the country, huge area. They've just been spreading ever since they were released, well beyond obviously the small sugarcane growing districts of Queensland. And cane toads, I said they're like a frog, but they're actually a toad. Australia doesn't have any native toads. And the toads carry a suite of defensive toxins that they make that are great for defending toads, but none of our Australian frogs have those same toxins. And so essentially what you have is an animal that looks like a frog, it smells like a frog, but it's carrying a set of toxins that none of Australia's predators have had any evolutionary exposure to. And so most of our predators have no resistance to this toxin and are killed very rapidly when they make the mistake of trying to eat a toad. So there's absolutely no doubt that toads have killed millions of Australian animals as they have spread across the country, and they've caused massive declines in charismatic species like quolls and large goannas. Those many populations of those animals have gone extinct when toads have arrived. Some of those populations have hung on. So as far as we know, they've not caused any global extinctions, but certainly lots of local extinctions. Kind of in the realm of 90 to 95% declines in a whole range of native animals, and that's caused that goes on to cause big impacts on their genetic diversity as well. So, for example, a recent paper that Brenton von Takach, who works with me, put out estimating that cane toads are associated with about a 95% decline in genetic diversity in northern quoll populations. So they come through, the quolls get hammered, a few populations hold on, but there's just so few individuals that essentially the population that comes back has very little genetic diversity. And so that, of course, sets all those populations up for future, to not be as resilient to future impacts as they would have been otherwise.
These toads themselves, Ben, could you paint a picture for us? Because you say they look like frogs, but geez, they're big.
Yeah, that's right. So I guess the average toad is about the size of your fist. Probably the biggest toad that I've seen in a museum would probably be about the length of your forearm. So they can get up to 1.5 kilos. You very, very rarely see them that size. Much closer to kind of fist size. So they're, by Australian standards, they're a very big frog. They're brown. They have depending on whether it's a male or a female, they have different colour on their backs. But one characteristic is they have these massive glands on their shoulders that are just full of a complex cocktail of chemicals, none of which that you would like to eat.
Look, apart from the damage, often fatal, that can happen when toads are actually eaten by native wildlife, what do they themselves predate on, and is that part of the destruction that they wield as well?
Yeah, it's a good question, and scientists have thought about that. At this point, no one's really shown a major impact in terms of predation. We know that they reach much higher biomass than other frog species in some areas. So in some places you might end up that 90% of the amphibian biomass is made up of toads. So they can get to huge densities. And of course they're eating lots and lots of insects and really anything small enough to get in their mouth. So they certainly eat insects. They've been known to eat baby birds. They have disrupted, so there's ground nesting birds like rainbow bee eaters, for example. They're known to clog up their nests and eat the chicks. But by and large, this kind of impact from predation has been very difficult to show that it's actually had a major impact on populations.
Just reading through some of the research, apparently their predation of dung beetles has an effect as far as processing cattle feces.
Yeah, that's right. So so this is work some colleagues of mine undertook, but that around some of these this pastoral infrastructure in the drier parts of northern Australia, you can get very high densities of toads. And of course, they have to survive on something while they're there. They'll eat all the insects. And of course, those water points are also bringing in the cattle. So they're also a major point for dung beetles to do their business, so to speak. And the toads have a major impact on the numbers of dung beetles in those areas. So and a lot of these dung beetles have been brought in by pastoralists to help control to help bury the cattle poo and turn over nutrients and reduce the parasite load in cattle and various other things. So on one hand, we're introducing a species to help to be of a benefit to agriculture. And on the other hand, we have this invasive species coming along and gobbling them all up.
Well, look, it's time to get down to brass tacks, Ben. As the cane toad has made its way westward, have there been efforts over time to stop that push?
Yeah, there has. So probably the biggest effort was mounted as they came across the Western Australian border in kind of, I guess, between about 2006 to 2009. There was a very big effort pushed by the community, largely based out of Kununurra, to try and stop the toads getting into Western Australia.
I'm of the vintage that remembers that quite clearly, Ben. Was that when everyone was encouraged to pop them in the freezer?
Yeah, that's right. So there was a couple of community groups that sprung up around that, and there was a lot of community effort and community excitement about the idea that we might be able to stop cane toads getting into Western Australia. It was an idea that I think the community massively underestimated the challenge that was before them. Essentially, it was like trying to stop the tide with a whole bunch of buckets, right? So that's not a bad analogy, right? The sheer numbers of animals moving around and the rate that they can breed. So each female toad might have somewhere between 5 and 30,000 eggs in a sitting, and on the invasion front, they move huge distances. They might move 40 to 50 kilometres in a wet season. So you've got these huge numbers, and you've got really fast movement, and on top of that, you've just got this incredibly remote and difficult to access landscape. And so really, there was never any chance that all of that effort could have prevented the toads from arriving in Western Australia, and indeed, there's no evidence that it made any difference whatsoever. What it did do, however, was brought communities together around this idea, and so there's a lot of good community, co-benefits that came out of that around community building and friendships and relationships inside the community. But in terms of an exercise to stop toads, it did not work.
You're involved in the Toad Containment Zone project, and I'd like to know all about this because obviously it's not a biological deterrent. It's a very different strategy.
Yeah. So the idea of the Toad Containment Zone, this is an idea that has, I guess, built out of decades of research now. So I guess the first inkling I got out of it was actually at a workshop organised by one of the community groups that were busting toads up in Kununurra, right? So they organised a big workshop to bring scientists together from all over the country and community groups to think about how the toads could be controlled. And there'd been a group different from the group I was working in with. They'd been working on cane toads in arid areas, and they'd worked out that you could create little fences around artificial water points, and when you did that, the toads would all die because they wouldn't be able to get to the water in these dry areas. And then they'd zoomed out of the map and they'd looked at where all of the artificial water points were in Australia, and they found this kind of really skinny stretch between Broome and Port Hedland where essentially the Great Sandy Desert hits the coast, and you've got this tiny little skinny stretch of country where people graze cattle and bring water up to graze cattle. And so this guy called Mike Letnick, he's an ecologist, quite a creative thinker and an ecologist, and he'd noticed this and he was like, geez, if you were going to stop toads anywhere, that would be the spot. You know, it's like 30 or 40 k's wide, it's 400 kilometres long, and they have to move through there if they're going to get down to Port Hedland and to Pilbara. So his group did a bunch of work around that, around the idea, just saying, how, is it likely to work? And then my group also did some work around the modelling. So we'd been doing lots of field work on cane toads out of University of Sydney. We'd done lots of radio tracking, so we knew how cane toads moved. We knew about how they bred and so forth, and we were able to put all of that into a model. All of that learning, I guess, from our work and various other people into a model that described the way toads breed and move across the landscape, and we used that model to I guess test the idea that it might be possible to stop toads between Broome and Port Hedland. And the basic idea is that every wet season it rains, you get cyclones, there's water everywhere. The cane toads move and breed during the wet season. But then every dry season they need to come back to water. And if they don't have that water, they die really quickly, because remember we're talking about a rainforest frog that's cruising through northern Australia, which is very, very dry in the dry season.
They are really tough customers, aren't they?
Yeah, well, they're really tough, but at that time of year they need water every 24 to 36 hours, right? And if they don't get that, they die really quickly. They just dry out, they perish. And so every dry season they need to find water. And in this particular stretch of country between Broome and Port Hedland, almost all of the water that's on the ground is water that's been brought up for agricultural purposes. So it's all water that's already managed by people. And so what we did with the modelling was we just imagined that those water points weren't there, right? Easy. That's a really easy thing to do in a model. And we could work out basically how wide we would need to make a break in this landscape of water points to stop toads. So it works basically the same idea as a fire break, right? You've got this bushfire raging towards you. Best way to stop it is to put some burnt country in front of it where the fire can't be supported, and the fire will stop, right? So it's exactly the same idea as that, except we're using that idea to stop the invasion of an invasive species, cane toads in this case.
How does the actual containment zone project take shape? How does it manifest? How does it work?
Yeah, so on the ground, we obviously can't remove these pastoral water points in the same way that we do in the model, right? In the model, you just delete points and they disappear and they can't support these kind of toads that you simulate. But in the real world, those water points are critical infrastructure for pastoralists making their livelihood, right? So instead of removing those water points, our intention is simply to upgrade them, right? And toads are not very good at climbing. So it's entirely possible to make a water tank and a water trough that cane toads can't access, but the cattle still can, right? So it's a large part of this project is simply upgrading existing infrastructure. So it's an improvement in the infrastructure on the property and setting up infrastructure that doesn't leak. And if we do that, then it's essentially gone as far as the toads are concerned.
Ben, that would suggest it's a one-time only event, really, or chance.
This is really a once-in-a-lifetime chance to stop the toads. So there's been nowhere else in their invasion history across northern Australia where this opportunity has presented itself. And we've been waiting for it now for 2011 or 2010 it was pointed out to me. So we've been waiting for the toads to get there, knowing that there was nothing we could do to stop them spreading through the Kimberley, which was just a tragedy. But we can do something about them getting to Pilbara.
How far out from that containment line are they, and when do you expect them to arrive?
Yeah, so they came into Western Australia in 2009 and it's now 2024, and they have completely invaded the Kimberley. So many people in West Australia don't realise that that's happened, but the cane toads have spread across the entirety of the Kimberley now. They got to Derby last year, and they're now, as of a few weeks ago, they are about 16 kilometres west of the Fitzroy River on the main highway to Broome. So they're heading to Broome, and they will probably be there in 3 to 4 wet seasons. And that's about when we need to be ready. They'll get to the top of this area that we're calling the toad containment zone. They'll get to the top of that area at about the same time. So we've got about 4 years, 3 to 4 years to get this done.
Ben, you are saying we, and you are gathering the troops. Tell us who was actually involved and who have you galvanised to make this project happen?
Yeah, so the project has come out of, so as I said, we had a very long time to prepare in lots of ways. So being scientists, and there's a group of us kind of independently looking at this idea. We've gone out and done lots and lots of critical tests of the idea. So can toads survive on cowpats? Can they survive down burrows? How far do they move? What about these assumptions in the model? There's lots of work that's gone on to, I guess, see if we could break the idea, and we haven't managed to break the idea through science. And a lot of those ideas, we needed to go and talk to the local community on the ground to make sure that our data were right and that our assumptions about how the world works in this part of the world were right, and so forth. So we've started a conversation with people on the ground, that's Indigenous landowners and the pastoralists, since about 2015. So we've kind of had this kind of long running discussion with these folks on the ground. And now we're getting to the point where the toads are 3 or 4 years away, and those people have been thinking about this idea for a long time, and they're all very keen to do what they can to stop the toads, partly because, certainly for the Indigenous landowners, it's fundamental to them that they want to look after their country, and so they see this as really important. And to the pastoralists, of course, they also would prefer not to have toads, and I think everyone on the ground would like to make this work, right? The potential impact, or the potential what this project potentially delivers, right, is 27 million hectares of Australia that toads don't get into. It keeps them out of the Pilbara, it keeps them out of areas further south. So it's a nationally significant conservation action if we can pull it off, and everyone on the ground is quite excited about doing that. And so the people on the ground are keen to do it, but of course it requires resources, it requires planning, and certainly because it's involving upgrading and maintaining pastoral infrastructure, it's definitely going to require some money and some resources to make that happen. Pastoralists can't afford to do that on their own. So, that brings in the state government and environmental groups and, this emerging environmental market. There's potentially a huge impact on the Pilbara, which will have an impact on mining, the mining industry in the Pilbara. So the mining industry is interested in making this happen as well. So there's a large number of people gathering around this project right now to see if we can pull it off and get it done in time to stop the toads.
And obviously that's in part due to the history of cane toads and their impact on wildlife, but more directly, we've now seen what's been happening in the Kimberley. And can you tell us exactly how it's manifested in the Kimberley? Are there specific species that have really been affected by the arrival of these toads?
Absolutely, yeah. So we had work. We were working on northern quolls, for example, right? So this is a reasonably large by Australian standards carnivore. They're this one of the spotty native cat things. We had a bunch of surveys in a bunch of sites as cane toads came through, and we saw somewhere between 70 and 95% declines within months of the toads arriving. So those populations crashed, and that has now happened across all of the Kimberley. We can expect that to translate into a 95% decline in genetic diversity. There are still quolls in the Kimberley, and those quolls will adapt to the presence of toads, but we will never get back that 95% of their genetic diversity that's gone. So that's a permanent impact. The same thing has happened for a suite of large goanna species, so things like floodplain monitors. This is one of our largest lizards in the country, and again a very charismatic species. They decline by 70 to 95% on average. So we have local extinctions of those happening all across the Kimberley. There's a suite of other species that are also impacted to more or to larger or lesser extents. And we're probably going to see another, I guess, from that invasion to Kimberley, the conservation listing process goes more slowly than the toads. But we're going to see at least 3 or 4 new species added to the threatened species list that we know about already. Northern blue tongues are another one that is a species that are very badly impacted by toads. So yeah, anyway, so there's a suite of species that are very badly impacted.
Oh, I mean, when you're talking 70 to 90% of a population of one species, that
puts COVID into perspective, doesn't it?
It certainly does, but also that is a real tangible imbalance of the ecosystem as a result, isn't it?
Yeah, so I mean, the flow-on effects are incredibly complicated, and we really don't know all of the flow-on effects. But it's safe to say that the ecosystem is fundamentally changed after the toads come through. So those large goannas, when they get taken out, that reduces the amount of predation on some smaller species. So some species actually get a benefit from toads being there, but fundamentally it's a very different ecosystem, I guess, after the toads have come through.
Critical question here, Ben. When the toads arrive at the toad containment zone, will you know within one wet season whether or not it's a success? Is it that simple?
It probably is, yeah. And we'll probably give it 2 years to see if it's worked, because there's parts of the toad containment zone that we expect that they'll get into, and we probably won't be able to get them out of, so that'll take a little while to settle out. But yeah, we should know pretty quickly. We'll know where they got to in the wet season, and then we'll be able to see where they are at the end of the dry season as well. So yeah, we should know very quickly whether it's working.
Professor Ben Phillips, thank you for being with us in studio today to talk about this. We are all watching on to see if this incredible idea actually works.
Thanks, David. Yeah, we're all watching with bated breath.
You've been listening to The Future Of, a podcast powered by Curtin University. As always, if you've enjoyed this episode, please share it. And don't forget to subscribe to The Future Of on your favourite podcast app. Bye for now.